Have you ever wondered where Cain's and Seth's wives came from? If Adam and Eve were the first humans, who were their daughters? And why does almost no one talk about them? Today, I'll tell you the forbidden story of Adam and Eve's daughters, a hidden narrative woven through ancient texts, forgotten traditions, and mysteries that challenge what you thought you knew. Get ready. What you're about to discover could change your way of seeing Genesis forever. Have you ever asked why, if Adam and Eve were the first humans, the Bible only mentions their sons? Where are their daughters? Why are they never discussed? The official biblical narrative, as presented in the book of Genesis, gives a limited and selective view of the first human family. We are told that Adam and Eve had 3 children, Cain, Abel, and later Seth. Cain is known for murdering Abel, and Seth is called the replacement, through whom God's righteous line would continue. But Genesis 4:17 introduces an apparent contradiction. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. If at that time only Adam, Eve, and their sons existed, who was this woman? The text doesn't explain. It simply assumes her existence. This omission has raised questions for centuries and led many to seek answers beyond the canonical Bible. It's not until Genesis 5:4 that a fleeting mention changes everything. After Seth was born, Adam lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. In other words, Adam and Eve did have more children, including daughters. Yet these daughters receive no names, stories, or prominence. They are mentioned only as a marginal note. This omission seems deliberate. Why does the Bible avoid providing details about them? What role did they really play in the beginnings of humanity? And why, if they were so central, was their history forgotten? To find answers, we must look beyond the official texts. The forbidden story is only just beginning. What if Cain's and Seth's wives were not mysterious strangers, but intentionally forgotten figures? What happened to Adam and Eve's daughters? Why does the Bible barely mention them, when they must have been as fundamental as their brothers to humanity's continuity? After Cain is exiled for killing Abel, Genesis 4:17 states he had a son and named him Enoch. This logically raises the question, if only Adam, Eve, and their sons existed, how did he find a wife? Some literalist Bible readers assert that Cain married one of his sisters. Though uncomfortable by modern standards, this possibility was accepted in ancient times because there was no alternative. If Adam and Eve were the first humans, their children had no choice but to intermarry. However, the Bible does not give names or details for these daughters. Only in Genesis 5:4, almost as a footnote, do we read that Adam fathered sons and daughters. But these female figures vanish from the narrative with no further explanation. This has prompted scholars, theologians, and ancient authors to wonder whether their omission was deliberate or simply reflected a patriarchal logic that only males were worthy of mention. In the early centuries of Christianity and the Second Temple period Judaism, various texts attempted to fill these gaps. Among them, now apocryphal works like the Book of Jubilees and the life of Adam and Eve offer names and roles for these daughters. For example, the Book of Jubilees refers to Cain's wife as his sister Awan, and Seth's wife as Azurah, also his sister. These texts argue that sibling marriages were necessary in humanity's early days, and were not considered immoral in that context. Moreover, rabbinic and Gnostic traditions preserve versions in which these women played far more active roles than in the official narrative. Some versions even attribute sacred or prophetic qualities to them. Yet those traditions were marginalized, and these texts excluded from both Jewish and Christian canons. Why were these female figures erased or ignored? The answer may lie in the highly patriarchal nature of societies that transmitted and preserved biblical texts. In many ancient contexts, genealogies and sacred stories focused exclusively on men, as they were seen as carriers of spiritual, social, and political inheritance. Women, even those essential for reproduction and familial continuity, were relegated to silence or secondary roles. This doesn't mean Adam and Eve's daughters were entirely unknown in their time. Oral traditions may have preserved their names and stories for generations before being recorded in texts now considered marginal. But as sacred texts became formalized, their stories were set aside. So, rather than an unsolvable mystery, Adam and Eve's daughters appear to be crucial pieces in a story told only partially. Their silence in the biblical text does not imply non-existence, but deliberate minimization. Exploring these hidden narratives allows us to piece together a fuller, richer, and more complex vision of human origin in Judeo-Christian tradition. Why do ancient texts mention Adam and Eve's daughters by name, with clear stories and roles, while the official Bible remains almost completely silent about them? What are apocryphal writings and ancient traditions hiding about these elusive female figures? To understand the possible connection between those daughters and Cain's and Seth's wives, we must venture beyond the biblical canon into texts excluded or suppressed over centuries. One important example is the Book of Jubilees, a Jewish work from around the 2nd century BC. It names Cain's wife as his sister Awan, and Seth's as Azura, also his sister. Although incestuous by modern standards, sibling marriages were deemed necessary and inevitable in early human narratives. Another text, the Life of Adam and Eve, or Book of Adam and Eve, appears in multiple versions across Latin, Greek, Slavic, and Ethiopian traditions, and also suggests sibling marriages. These writings, though discarded by later canons, were widely read in religious communities, signaling their significance in ancient tradition. Rabbinic literature, such as certain midrashim, mentions sisters of Cain and Seth, sometimes called Awan, Luluwa, or Azura, and discusses the ethical and legal implications of early sibling marriage. These writings reflect a theological and narrative desire to fill in the gaps of the biblical account. This discussion isn't limited to Jewish tradition. Early Christianity, particularly in Gnostic and esoteric circles, also explored alternative accounts of Adam's daughters. Works like the Gospel of the Egyptians, part of the Nag Hammadi library, speak of female figures embodying aspects of divine wisdom. In these traditions, Adam's daughters were not merely human companions, but symbolic manifestations of lost divine knowledge. As the early church solidified a unified narrative, Gnostic and apocryphal texts were condemned as heretical, and alternate stories suppressed. What remained was a condensed version that largely erased women, apart from Eve, Sarah, or Mary, who served specific patriarchal roles. Similarly, myths from the ancient Near East, including pre-Islamic Arabian and later Islamic writings, also describe Adam as having daughters who married their brothers. These versions, though outside official Islamic doctrine, reflect the enduring concern across cultures. Who were the first wives of humanity's earliest men? The silence of the canonical Bible on Adam and Eve's daughters appears not to be accidental, but editorial and theological. In societies where male genealogy defined religious and social identity, recognizing Adam and Eve's daughters by name and role could have challenged entrenched power structures. Excluding them helped maintain a male-centered narrative that would persist for centuries. However, the fact that their names and roles appear in multiple non-canonical texts shows they were not entirely forgotten. Communities outside doctrinal orthodoxy continued passing on their stories, recognizing the need for a more coherent origin account. Adam and Eve's daughters existed not only as biological necessity, but as symbols of a broader, more nuanced, and perhaps truer story. By recovering these hidden voices, we're doing more than retrieving forgotten names. We're questioning how histories are constructed, who decides what is included or excluded, and why certain truths are suppressed. The daughters of Adam and Eve invite us to examine with fresh eyes the official narrative and ask how many other stories have been erased or edited to fit a more comfortable version of history. Today, thanks to access to alternative texts and critical religious scholarship, we can begin to reconstruct part of that lost narrative. Adam and Eve's daughters are not an unsolvable myth. They're key pieces of a larger story that's been half told for centuries. Naming them and exploring their role is an act of historical and symbolic justice. Every story has another side. Sometimes the voices omitted are the most important. Could science partially validate the necessity of sibling unions at humanity's origins? What do genetics and anthropology say about the first human population and possible reproductive scenarios? While Genesis presents a symbolically charged theological narrative, modern science also asks vital questions. How many individuals would be needed to found a viable population? Was there really a single Adam and Eve, or a broader group? And what does that mean for the daughters of Adam and Eve? Genetics has identified population bottlenecks in human evolution, periods when humanity shrank to a small group of ancestors for all people alive today. This gave rise to concepts like the Y-chromosomal Adam and the mitochondrial Eve. Though not a literal pair, they reflect the idea that all living humans share recent common ancestors, suggesting that humanity descended from a small founding group. Science also affirms that a viable population cannot begin with just two people. Studies suggest that to avoid extinction from inbreeding, a founding population of several hundred individuals would be needed. That challenges a literal reading of Genesis, but doesn't negate its symbolic value. In this light, stories of Adam and Eve's daughters may echo an ancient awareness of early reproductive requirements, expressed in mythic terms. Anthropology reinforces this. Many cultures have origin myths, where the first humans emerge from one pair or a small group. These myths often include sibling marriages, less as moral acts than cultural narratives about human expansion. The story of Adam's daughters as wives of Cain and Seth may be interpreted not only as religious explanation, but as a cultural representation of human propagation from a founding clan. Some scholars even suggest Eden may not have been humanity's only home. Interpretations of Genesis, particularly Cain's flight, raise the possibility of other people existing outside Eden. When Cain fears for his life, God protects him with a mark. Who else outside his family could threaten him? Some theologians and anthropologists see this as evidence that the biblical narrative was centered on one lineage, with other groups unrecorded or symbolically represented. In summary, both genetics and anthropology help explain why Adam and Eve's daughters may have been essential in humanity's origins. Their marriages to Cain and Seth fit not only mythic storytelling, but scientific insights about small, interrelated founding populations. Modern science doesn't disprove the story. It lends new meaning to it. What if the official Genesis we know is just an edited version of a much larger and more complicated tale? Could Adam and Eve's daughters have been deliberately erased to fit a tighter, male-centric theological narrative? As we explore alternative theories and ancient writings, provocative questions emerge about what may have been suppressed. Some theories argue that omission of these women wasn't accident, but editorial decision during canon formation, discarding texts that provided alternative genealogies. Other esoteric viewpoints warn of mystical feminine spiritual knowledge that was intentionally eclipsed. Some fringe theorists propose Adam's daughters were gatekeepers of forbidden wisdom, a threat to religious elites, thus systematically removed from history. Of course, these theories lack academic consensus. Many are speculative. But their existence highlights a hunger to question official versions and recover silenced voices. Whether driven by religious, social, or symbolic reasons, the near-total omission of Adam and Eve's daughters in sacred texts has always sparked curiosity. Ultimately, the absence of these daughters leaves not just a historical void, but a fertile ground for questioning, reinterpretation, and recovery. Alternative theories invite us to look beyond what's written, consider what's been left unsaid, and ask why. We may never know the full truth, but simply asking these questions is an act of reclaiming a forgotten part of our ancestral story. The story of Adam and Eve's daughters shows us there's much more behind the official origin story. Were they real, symbolic, or deliberately erased? You decide. If you enjoyed this journey through forbidden texts and forgotten theories, please like, subscribe for more content like this, and tell me in the comments, do you believe these daughters really existed? What do you think about their mysterious disappearance? Your opinion deepens this community of truth seekers.